gentlemen, and welcome to Cinemology Radio. I'm your host, Joel Davidson, and today I'm joined by my friend Jackson Goldberg. Say hello, Jackson.
Hey.
So I guess a little bit of background on you before we get started, just to let the folks at home know.
Yeah, so I'm Jackson. I am a freelance filmmaker, and I have been fascinated by special effects, sci-fi movies since I was very young, and that kind of naturally led me on this path to Godzilla, kaiju, Japanese special effects. And yeah, I just love these movies and looking forward to talking about them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, there's a ton of crossover.
I don't know how much detail you want.
I mean that works. Yeah,
Okay.
Definitely for as far as context for the evening. Yeah, there's a ton of crossover between the kinds of films that we both enjoy, and I feel like since we started talking about films in general, it's always really interesting. Just I'll reference some movie that I feel like only I've seen, and like not only have you seen it, but you actually have some pretty in-depth opinions on them. So which is always great. So this is really a great thing being able to do this, talk about Godzilla and Ishiro Honda specifically here in today's episode, because that's been something I know in some of the Cinemology related videos, Cinemologist videos that I've done over the years. We've kind of touched on Godzilla. We've touched on Ishiro Honda's filmography a little bit, but it's going to be nice to actually talk about it more in depth. So this promises to be a really fun episode. So yeah. I guess as we lay the groundwork, lay the foundation for tonight's discussion, let's go back to the beginning. So Jackson, how did you discover Godzilla? And then from there, I guess, Ishiro Honda.
Well, it all started with Animal Planet, as all things do.
Elaborate, please.
Okay, so Animal Planet. I still do. I love animals. So I would watch these nature programs, and I was really into sharks. And Animal Planet, I don't know if they still do, but they used to run this show called Animal Icons. They talk about animals in the movies, basically. I was just starting to get into movies and animals, so okay, there's this intersection here. And they had this one episode about dinosaurs in movies, and I didn't know anything about dinosaurs. I hadn't seen any dinosaur movies or anything, so I thought that sounded interesting. And of course, Godzilla is featured very prominently in that special. And I don't know what it was in that moment that made me want to seek out all those movies, but just seeing these creatures that I had just never encountered before. They had Godzilla, they had Beast in 20,000 Fathoms, King Kong, something very magnetic about that. And so I made this list of all these movies that I now wanted to see, and they had all those movies on there. And then my parents, at one point or another, bought me a copy of the original Godzilla, and that was kind of the first one that I'd actually seen all the way through. And
how old would you have been at that time?
I would have been, I think, 10, okay. maybe just before 9 or 10. And seeing Godzilla, I mean, again, I hadn't seen a monster movie really. I mean, I'd seen like Jaws, but certainly not like a city-destroying dinosaur, atomic age movie. Of course, being that young, I didn't know anything about the subtext or Hiroshima or anything. But something about it was just instantly just apocalyptic and just something it felt completely otherworldly. And of course, this was the King of the Monsters, the American cut. Mm-hmm. And it opens just with Akira Kurosawa's just like guttural, like coming up from the depths of hell, like these weird dissonant tones, and just immediately it was like, this is something I've just never seen before, and it's something that just feels like really unique. And then of course, I became really into the craft and the whole world of Godzilla, and there's all these cool monsters, and but yeah, I mean, it kind of just began with the original, like that.
Yeah, interesting. For me, it began with Roland Emmerich, as all things do.
Oh no!
Yeah, this is going to get very sad very quickly. But no, for me, I may have heard of Godzilla before the American remake. My parents, would talk a lot about the films that they grew up seeing on television or in the theater. That's how I first heard about 2001: A Space Odyssey and Fantastic Voyage, all the movies that they grew up watching. They would tell me about them, and I'd be really intrigued and want to check them out. So I think they had mentioned the Godzilla movies, and I kind of got the gist. Oh, there's this city destroying dinosaur guy, and there's, the movies are Japanese, and then there's this really bad English dubbing, that they would always talk about, and I think they would say things like, oh, it's Godzilla's a man in a suit, and that just made me want to see it more, because I've always been really intrigued by handmade special effects, because as a small child I didn't really understand how films were made, and so any chance that I got when I could see, say strings or matte lines, or I could tell that somebody made the movie. It was a really special thing, because then I could go, oh, like someone made this, and I have to suspend my disbelief. And it was sort of it was kind of like a relationship to the filmmaker, and feeling like, oh, I get to, sort of peek behind the curtain a little bit, and then just, suspend my disbelief and enjoy it like that. So that really made me want to check them out. But I remember the first Godzilla thing that I saw was right after the Roland Emmerich movie left theaters, and I think it was the first time it was being shown on television. My family was watching it for some reason, and I was sitting there watching it. And as a small child, as bad as that movie is, there's something about seeing a giant dinosaur destroying a city, whatever the giant dinosaur happens to be. That's pretty intriguing. So I saw that, or bits and pieces of it, when it aired on TV. And then I was in a Blockbuster home video afterwards with my brother. We were picking out some movie. And I noticed this huge Godzilla display against one of the walls, all just VHS tapes, rows and rows of them. And I think I asked my brother, what are those? Look at all these Godzilla tapes. What are these? And he said, like, oh, those are all the other Godzilla movies. And it blew my mind. At that time, I did not, unfortunately, get to check out and rent one of the movies, but I kind of tucked that away. And later, once DVD, we bought a DVD player, and we were starting to buy movies. I think I asked my parents if they would order one of the Godzilla movies for me, and they said, which one? And so I did research. I went online, and there was this. I don't know if you ever discovered this. Maybe you did, maybe you didn't. I don't know if the Google algorithm took us to the same places in the early 2000s, but there was this Godzilla fan site. I think it was called Godzilla Temple.
Yes, Barry's Temple of Godzilla.
Yes, that was it.
I think it's still around.
Oh my gosh, I hope so. I need to dive back in there and have a heady nostalgia trip.
Oh god,
I discovered this website, and I was looking through all the movies and going like, oh, I want to see that one, or oh, I don't want to see that one. And for some reason, the Godzilla movie that I was obsessed with and had to see, just absolutely needed to watch, was Godzilla versus Megalon.
Well, that's one of the best ones.
I mean, clearly, yeah. Because I was like, wow, there's this Jet Jaguar guy, looks really cool, and it's a giant cockroach, and oh, what's this Gigan, guy? And they're all in the movie together. And Gigan went on to be like my favorite kaiju, who's fantastic. But that's another rabbit trail. So I said I would like to get Godzilla versus Megalon, and so they got that for me. They got Godzilla versus Mothra, and then Godzilla King of Monsters, the Americanized version of the original Godzilla. And I loved Godzilla versus Megalon. Also really enjoyed Godzilla versus Mothra. My experience seeing King of Monsters was something that I don't think I'll ever really forget. And again, kind of doubling back a few years, I guess I would have been 6 years old when 9/11 happened. And it was something that I didn't really understand. It was on TV. I remember waking up that morning and it being on TV, and my family was huddled around the television. I knew it was something really scary, but I was like, not really being able to process it as a little kid. I remember just drawing, pictures and not really paying attention to the TV, and just kind of tucking that away and not really thinking about it that much. We had family up in New York at the time, and obviously it was, really traumatic event for everybody. But it was something that I just kind of set aside, but didn't really think about that much. But when I saw Godzilla King of Monsters, I have a very clear memory of watching it. The weather was, a very clear, I think, fall day. Again, very much like that, like September 11th was. This was a few years later. I would have been, I think, 10 years old when I first saw the movie. And so I popped it in, I watched the film, didn't really have that much of an immediate reaction. I remember reacting to specific moments, like that opening with, when you hear the roar and you hear Akira Ifukube's score, and then other things, the first appearance of Godzilla, of course, and that shot towards the end where the mother has her two children and the city is burning around them. I remember all those things very clearly, but overall, the movie ended, and I think I went outside to play, and I remember looking out back, and we have kind of a view of the Philadelphia skyline in the distance of where we lived at the time. And in my mind's eye, looking at that skyline, I just remember like imagining or seeing just the shape of Godzilla out there, and against the skyline, just very silently moving across it, and I just got this very uneasy feeling, and I went back inside. And I don't know, it felt like watching that movie, and I wasn't able to put this together until fairly recently, thinking back on it. I think that movie and a lot of the trauma that's in there, for the nation of Japan and their experiences going through World War II, seeing that as a young kid, I think helped bring to the forefront the experiences of being a kid and seeing, 9/11 on television, dealing with that. And that's really, when I think of Godzilla, that's kind of at the time, obviously I love the giant monster battles and things like that. But going through the years, looking back at that first film in the King of Monsters version, that's really the memory that I equate with Godzilla, is being able to encounter something that's really traumatic and really difficult and giving it a shape.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that's what's so great about monsters in general, but Japanese monsters, is that they really kind of embody the infinite. I think in this way it's almost religious. It's recognition that there's something greater than us, and it's giving that a shape, like you said. And what I think distinguishes kaiju, Japanese monsters, from an American monster is that recognition that we're subservient to this, and that us and monsters, we're part of this order that we can't really understand, and we're just we have to just kind of be in awe and recognize the power of these monsters, because they can't be killed or controlled by conventional weaponry. That's why the Roland Emmerich Godzilla, I feel, a lot of other people feel, misses the point, because he gets killed, trapped in a bridge and then killed by missiles. But it's like describing the indescribable, I think.
Whereas, Jaws, you can blow him up, or
and Jaws, and of course, like, that's not to say Japanese monster movies are inherently better or worse than any other countries, but it's just what makes them so unique.
Yeah, I totally agree. So that's Godzilla. I think we've laid the groundwork there for our love of the Godzilla movies. Now let's move on to this guy, this Ishiro Honda guy. Directed the first Godzilla movie, a number of them afterwards. He directed the films that bookended Godzilla and Terror of Mechagodzilla.
Yeah.
And made a lot of other incredible films besides, and has a really phenomenal life story. So one thing that we'll be referencing, or I guess talking about as we talk about the films and talk a little bit about his life, is the book, Ishiro Honda, A Life in Film from Godzilla to Akira Kurosawa. Is that correct?
I can confirm that's correct.
All right, fantastic. I guess it was a couple years back, you had picked up a copy of the book and had read it, and then asked if I wanted to borrow it. I said, of course. I read through it as well. So yeah, let's talk about that biography for a little bit.
Sure. Let me think about how best to start this. So much has been written about Japanese film, and I love Japanese movies. I'm not as well versed in some of the directors like Mizoguchi. I've seen most of Kurosawa's movies, and there's been all this literature on Japanese cinema, but there really hasn't been on Honda. Ishiro Honda is someone who I've pretty much only known from his sci-fi movies, and most of the West knows him from his sci-fi movies, and which is great. I mean, his movies are great, but it's too bad, because he has such a rich filmography of dramatic films, and he has this really wonderful relationship with Akira Kurosawa that hasn't really gone documented for a long time. So being able to get that full portrait of him, pretty much his entire life story, is really is really invaluable. And I mean, part of the tragedy of, not necessarily tragedy, but what sticks out so much about Honda's life is how much it was defined by war. And how, you know, he was this great pacifist, and he hated war, and he hated what his country was doing, and how the whole world was acting during this time. But he kept, you know, he was drafted 3 times. He had to keep going through the cycle. He was torn, you know, between what he felt and his duty for his country and for his family. Seeing him handle that, and you know, being captured by the Chinese at one point, and nearly dying all these times, and kind of like it seems like almost like this divine intervention saving him, whether it be like a shell not going off or you know, surviving in the camps. It just gives the sense of this really rich life that you kind of wish. It's tragic that he wasn't able to begin really creating his own movies alongside Kurosawa in the early 40s, because he was displaced by war for so long.
Yeah, I couldn't believe that. In reading the book, I expected that I was just going to read essentially a filmography in the making of these movies, and I knew that there was going to be some biographical sketches in there. I did not expect that to be my major takeaway for the book, which is, for the most part, the way that it was. I mean, the stories of the productions of the films are fascinating, but his life was really incredible, just astounding. I mean, there are scenes in the book that I was so gripped by, just emotionally, and I could just sort of picture these things happening, which were just astounding. That moment that you alluded to, where he's under heavy fire and he's going across the battlefield looking for cover, and then a shell lands right in front of him, and he's, you know, pretty sure that he's going to die, and the shell doesn't go off, and then, you know, him going back later and digging up that unexploded shell and taking it home with him, and, you know, putting it on his desk to remind him that, you know, every day that he has is, from this point, is like a bonus. I just couldn't believe that.
So when he was in the military, he was put in charge of something called a comfort suite, which were these stations where Japanese soldiers could pretty much help themselves to, you know, women who were either captured or tricked into prostitution. And it's this, you know, obviously very serious blemish on Japanese history, and there are all these controversies nowadays, and politicians, there's a lot of them don't really have to talk about it still. And Honda had this position, was pretty much in charge of this comfort station, and he wrote about it later on, and he was very much opposed to it. He hated being there, but he also couldn't really do anything, and he couldn't really affect any sort of change. And actually, he talks about how he would counsel these women and kind of have them accept their situation rather than helping them escape it. And obviously, this is very heavy subject matter. We don't have to get into necessarily how this does or doesn't define Honda's character, but it's just another dark, complicated part of his life that you know, up until now, I don't think anyone, certainly in the States, really knew anything about.
Yeah, and that comes into the films to some extent as well. He, you know, did several films which were set during World War II, and even though obviously he would not have been able to explicitly depict these things, it's something that's kind of, you know, in the background, or euphemized or hinted at, that was something that was going on, which even so was a pretty bold move on his part, I think. And yeah, in those early days after the war, and then him going through the camps in China, and then his journey home. You know, what a story! What a story that was.
And his arrival home is described, I think, in a way that feels very cinematic too.
Yes.
You know, he's gone for so long, and of course, there's no way for him to communicate with his family. And one day, he just arrives on the doorstep, and his wife, instead of, you know, she doesn't collapse into tears right away, and she doesn't, you know, necessarily like come with the big embrace. She starts just chopping wood for a bath.
Yeah.
And whether or not that's exactly what happened, it just the way it's described in the book is really this great little moment of these two people who feel so connected from pretty much the moment they met. I mean, him and his wife started out as these two just kind of like-minded souls making movies and working in the same office together, and they weren't necessarily romantically involved right from the start, and that just kind of came very naturally between the two of them, and that moment when he comes home, I think, is just a really wonderful moment.
Yeah. Oh gosh, that was like really incredibly powerful, and it seemed, because she had, I think, at that point almost resigned to the fact that he was dead, right? That you know, because there was no communication between her and him, and she was in Tokyo, so they were under They were being bombed off and
Yeah.
on. It's really a wonder that he was, that they stayed in the same house and he was able to find them. And
Hmm.
yeah, as you said, that moment where it doesn't go down like it would in the movies, with some big emotional embrace and the orchestra swells. Yeah, she's just gathering
Hmm.
for a fire so he can have a hot bath. Yeah, incredible. And then his journey home too, on the train back, seeing, was it Hiroshima or Nagasaki that
I
he?
want to say it was. I want to say it was Hiroshima. And that's another moment too, where he actually kind of explicitly says, there's a quote from Honda where he says, that wasn't even so much a dramatic moment. It was just he was passing through on his way back from China on the train, and he just got off at the station, kind of looked around, just saw this complete unimaginable devastation, and then just kind of went on his way back home. It was just kind of part of the landscape almost. Who's to say what was going through his mind? But it's so hard to imagine how you're heading home and just like part of the country's just not there anymore.
Yeah,
It's crazy. I mean,
yeah, some really unbelievable stuff that certainly informed his life. So he and Akira Kurosawa were obviously friends and co-workers growing up, being assistant directors together.
hmm
And Honda went off. Honda was drafted. Kurosawa got out of the draft, correct?
yeah,
Because he had a
he had
relative who was connected in
yeah
some.
yeah that's right.
Mhm. So at that time, when Honda was off in the armed forces, Kurosawa was making his way up and directing his first films, and Honda was held back. And then, when did he direct his first feature? When did he finally get to direct?
Honda directed. He directed two documentaries in the late '40s. He directed Issei Shima in 1949 and Story of a Co-op in 1950. So Kurosawa directed Sanshiro Sugata in '43, I believe. Kurosawa had about a 6-year head start in terms of directing.
Yeah,
But he also had all this experience assistant directing, and you kind of wonder what would have happened if they had developed completely simultaneously.
yeah,
How that would have changed each other's career trajectories.
yeah, for sure. So Honda would have been, he was born in 1911, so he would have been in his late 30s when he did
Yeah.
those first docs. So from there on, he directed a couple of feature film dramas.
Hmm.
I guess where we can pick up here is maybe, we can take a little bit of time out. I know we already have to some extent, but maybe we can talk about Godzilla. I mean, why not?
Sure.
1954. Let's start with a bang.
It's really hard to overstate how incredibly unique of a monster movie this is,
Mm,
because this is a film from a country that had experienced some semblance of the apocalypse in terms of just the amount of lives taken in one fell swoop and just the devastation. And it's this really fascinating document that it's almost like scream therapy. It's like you're seeing this country that is technically in the middle of this economic upswing, but it still suffered this horrific devastation, and it's just grappling with its place in the world and the responsibility that people have
yeah,
when it comes to science and when it comes to progress and defending themselves from things that are deemed exterior threats. The movie, in a weird way, its allegiance is almost, you're seeing this movie from a very grounded point of view. You're seeing it from these two lovers and Serizawa, the scientist, and this paternal figure played by Takashi Shimura. And so you're grounded in the people, but at the same time, Godzilla is treated as sort of this tragic figure, and at times, especially at the end, which is this very mournful, graceful finale. It's very different from like King Kong or Beast 20,000 Fathoms, where they're going at the monster and they're going to take it down, and the monster's like fighting back and everything. Godzilla is treated as kind of this passive, really sort of sad and lonely animal, and I kind of can't help but think that like there's some identification with Godzilla as this scarred, kind of wandering being in the world, and it's just interesting seeing how that point of view kind of oscillates throughout the film.
it's very interesting too, seeing what happened with Godzilla over the years. Eventually becoming an almost, I mean, maybe not heroic figure, but certainly someone that fights on the side of the humans, or
Yeah,
becomes,
the
more
lesser of two
overtly.
evils.
Yeah, exactly. Which is interesting how that plays into the whole recipe as well.
Mhm.
It is a frightening film. I mean, to watch. There's a lot of steps taken towards making the film feel real, to really involve you in what's going on. And when you do see the devastation, often you're seeing it from ground level. It's, if you're looking at Godzilla, you're looking up. at this
Oh, yeah.
towering figure. So much time's devoted to logistics, political meetings and
Mhm.
the hospitals where they're taking the dead and then dying, and
I mean, just thinking about the opening, how it starts, you're on the ocean, and it's really kind of disorienting. You just get placed in this little vignette of this crew, and just suddenly the ocean lights up, and you don't know what's going on. There's confusion. It's cutting to the radio operator, and there's no exposition. What you're learning in the first couple of minutes of the movie is through the characters figuring out what's going on, and not even figuring out what's going on, but experiencing just this random kind of devastation, and you're thrown back into the mainland, and there's this investigation going on. People just are totally clueless. Like, there's no journey into the unknown scene. Like, there's nothing like in The Thing or in Beast of 20,000 Fathoms, where you have like the set of scientists and they're like, we're here to do this, and we're going in and we're going to take care of this, and then they encounter a dinosaur or a monster. It just throws you in, and it feels like it's kind of being captured in real time almost. And of course, going back to that scene on the ship, Honda's making great strides to ground this movie in real events. So that opening scene is based pretty obviously on the Lucky Dragon incident, when this Japanese fishing boat wandered into its nuclear testing site. Americans were dropping bombs in the Marshall Islands, and the boat was contaminated, and the crew came back, and a lot of them died. A lot of the fish was contaminated. And then later on, you get this couple on the train that's talking about, we survived Nagasaki, now we have to survive Godzilla.
right.
It's very charged and raw, and he never lets you forget that.
Yeah, a lot of very real pain and fear that the country would have been going through. I can't imagine what it would have been like seeing this in the theater at that time as a Japanese citizen. That whole sequence on the island as well. The investigation, the typhoon, and that build up to when you first see the monster for the first time, and even the setup on the island. And this goes to something that I think Honda does incredibly well, and we see it in a lot of his films, a really great sense of place and of culture. Some of his earlier films, there's the one I think that was set with the Ama Pearl Divers.
Yeah, that was his first narrative film.
Yeah, what was that called again?
The Blue Pearl.
The Blue Pearl, yeah. From that film, to other films we'll touch on later, there's always a really big sense of culture and of place. You even see that in fantastical cultures, like in Mothra, Mothra Island, and
absolutely,
and Atragon with the undersea world there. You really do get a sense for the people and their local customs, the way that they live their lives, and even though it's just a pretty small segment of the film, that you're really thrown again in a place that feels real. And that sequence, my gosh, when they're going up the mountain and you first see just that piece of Godzilla.
Oh yeah.
Will forever stick with me. It's such a brilliant, just from a technical perspective, it's such a brilliant effect shot. There's really, few other moments in any of the Godzilla films where he's joined that perfectly with the human characters.
Oh yeah.
And it took me a long time to even fathom how they did it.
On the commentary, David Kella talks about, and I recommend that commentary. It's a great listen.
Mm-hmm.
But he talks about, so that's a double exposure shot. They basically built the top of the crest of the mountain that comes over. Godzilla comes up over it. They print that, and then they, on the same strip of cellular, they're shooting the people running away. And you're right, it looks, and of course, you can tell Godzilla's a puppet, but in that moment, it's so sudden, and the contrast with the people is so stark.
Mm-hmm.
It is a really great effect. It's really unsettling, and it's such a contrast to the rest of the film, where he's kind of obscured in darkness or in smoke. It's just you're just seeing him right there, and it's just enough to be a little bit horrifying.
Mm-hmm.
Without lingering on too much.
Yeah, and the sound that you hear is the screams of the people. Not Godzilla's roar either. So it's, again, kind of grounding you in with the human characters and experiencing their fear.
Yeah, but you do hear Godzilla's roar, which is just the greatest sound ever, I think, in cinema.
I'm sure you did this as well. I just remember being a little kid just going around making that noise.
Oh yeah,
yeah. So it's echoed around the hallways.
Yeah, and we should talk about how Akira Kurosawa, Honda directed this movie, but Kurosawa really helped define the sound of the character, and that contributes so much to Godzilla's personality in this movie.
Yes.
He just sounds completely, it doesn't sound mechanical, but it doesn't sound quite natural either. It's really hard to describe. I think I said earlier, like something like coming up from the depths of hell. And that's what it sounds like in this movie.
Yeah.
And the footsteps too. We should talk, that's the first thing you hear. And that just immediately establishes this unrelenting thing that we can't really do anything about. It's just going to kind of keep coming.
And that really sells that sense of scale. Even the roar, like you were talking about. I mean, compare that to, most dinosaurs in American cinema up to that time. Not knocking these movies because they're great.
Oh, of course not.
But say, in King Kong, the T-Rex, almost sounds more like a cat or a dog, like some normal sized animal, in comparison to Godzilla, which is just, it truly is. You get a sense of something that is stories and stories tall, making that noise.
Yeah. Well, it sounds, this might be obvious because that's how they created the noise, but the closest thing it sounds to is like music. His roar is almost kind of lyrical. Fukube, being a composer, he took a contrabass and he loosened the strings and rubbed a glove against it, and that's how he created the noise. But you're right, it doesn't sound like a hiss or a snarl like the T-Rex in King Kong or like the beast from 20,000 Fathoms. Yeah, it's just something utterly unique. Yeah, so do you want to talk about because I think the human aspect of this movie is actually really interesting.
Yes, yeah.
So like I said, he's really grounding these characters. He's really grounding the story from the point of view of this love triangle between Emiko and Serizawa and Ogata, and also Dr. Yamane, played by Takashi Shimura, who's a mainstay of Kurosawa's. Especially with Serizawa and with Dr. Yamane, you get these really conflicted characters. And this is something that we'll see in a lot of Honda's movies, but they're torn between what their heart tells them to do. So Yamane, wants to study Godzilla, and he wants to figure out how it survived this radiation. Serizawa wants to keep the oxygen destroyer secret, otherwise, lest it become this weapon of destruction. And what their countries, asking them to do, which is to kill Godzilla and to make sure that he doesn't hurt any more people, which, is kind of the logical thing, but it's overridden by this emotional struggle. They're just two really tragic characters. Yamane, I think, is especially kind of endearing. Yamane is like, when I watch the movie again, he's almost like childlike in the way he acts. Like his enthusiasm almost like always gets the better of him. Like the very first time he shows up and he's giving that report to the committee about Godzilla's attack on Odo Island, you see he gets up and he's a little bit too hasty to get up, and his tie is flapping outside of his jacket, and he just kind of like very subtly just like kind of tucks it in, like he was almost too hasty to get up and talk about this hypothesis that he has. And then later when he's bending over to pick up the trilobite and he's like, look at this is incredible, and
Right,
the other guy's like,
do
not touch that with your bare hands. And then even later his daughter Emiko, he's really upset that no one else is interested in studying Godzilla, and he kind of just goes off and sulks in the corner for a while, and his daughter actually kind of acts in this really motherly way, where she kind of asks him if he's all right, and he kind of needs the space to himself, and she turns the light off for him and leaves him, kind of lets him be. But that's a character who Yamane, I know in the original draft of the film, or one of the original drafts of the film, was actually more of a villainous character, and he wore like this. Yeah, he wore like this. This is mentioned, I think, on the special features of the classic media DVD release. And he wore this cloak, and he tried to sabotage the electrical instrument at the end of the movie. And I just think the balance that Honda strikes between someone who knows what the right thing to do is, but still has this other, scientific desire and something maybe that transcends, basic human decency. I just think it's a really sympathetic character, and one that could have been played totally villainous, but isn't.
Right, true. And there really isn't a villain figure in the movie in that way, which is great. It's, people, as you said, knowing what they have to do, but also having these other desires, which plays into the love triangle as well. One relationship makes sense culturally, and then another one is, there's real romantic desire there, which, again, is what Ogata and Emiko feel for each other versus Emiko's arranged marriage to Dr. Serizawa.
Yeah, and again, Serizawa isn't played like a resentful cuckold,
right?
And he's also not played as a mad scientist. He's someone who's really weighed down by this discovery that he's made. He's very concerned about the implications that it has for all of humanity. It's like global perspective, characters thinking about not just their own country, but how this affects the world. That's also something that Honda, I think, is very preoccupied with across a lot of his, especially his earlier ones, but a lot of his sci-fi movies.
It's funny, too, because he does, Dr. Serizawa, who is played, I guess we should mention by, I hope I can get this right, Akihiko Hirata?
That's right.
Is that correct? Yes, who is a Honda mainstay. I think he's in almost all of the movies that we're going to talk about today.
I think all but one, yeah.
A very good actor. And the way that he's portrayed in the film, the environment of his laboratory, it is a mad scientist setup. He's got the eye patch, he's got the room with all the dark shadows and the dusty beakers, and And he has the doomsday device, but he's not played that way. He's not written that way. He is a conflicted character who wants to do the right thing. Certainly does have a kind of madness, a fixation on his work, but it's tempted by conscience, by not wanting to let, his doomsday device be used for those nefarious purposes, which I think, again, is very unusual for a film of this type.
Yeah, and especially, we're going to see later on, he would later play a mad scientist, kind of how you would expect this character to be played. And we can get to that later on, but the contrast between him here and him in the last Showa Godzilla movie is pretty. Let's just say, I think the comparison does Serizawa a lot of favors.
Yes.
Yeah, and that lab, just the way that Honda shoots it, it's this place of complete. It's isolation, but it's the layer of someone who knows that they're isolated and they're looking for some sort of connection. Like there's that great, when we first walk in to the lab, there's this great shower. Emiko, they both walk in, and Emiko walks over to the fish tank that's in the middle of the lab.
Yeah.
And Serizawa disappears off the side. She goes over and she looks at the fish, and then Honda is panning across the fish, and we find Serizawa on the other side, and he looks so small and hemmed in by everything around him. It's someone who's at once fascinated by science and is also totally trapped by it.
Yeah.
It feels like if you just look at photos of that set, it feels very over the top, but it's a really kind of sorrowful place.
Yeah, there's a film noir quality to how it's shot. Lots of very deep shadows and dark textures in the lighting. Yeah.
Yes.
We've talked about Godzilla for almost a half an hour. So
it's probably the most substantive film that we're going to talk about.
Probably, extraordinary. Now, believe it or not, I had not seen the original 1954 version until just this past year. For years and years, the only version that I had encountered was the Americanized version with Raymond Burr scenes. When was the first time that you saw the original 54 version?
I saw it probably a year after I saw King of the Monsters. Yeah, I don't think the differences really registered with me right away when I saw it. I of course noticed, the scenes that were there that weren't there before, but it took a couple of viewings to really get why that movie is so, again, substantive, and why King of the Monsters is, I think a well done revision, but one that's certainly a lot less weighty.
Sure. Although as you said, it's kind of shocking how well done it is. Compared to, and we've seen other Godzilla movies where this has happened.
Especially, I mean, you have King Kong versus Godzilla, where you have a guy you have an American scientist supposedly reading out of a kid's book.
It's not John Carradine, is it?
No, John Carradine is in the American version of Half Human, though.
Oh, okay. I was about to say he must have been busy that week. When they were doing King Kong versus Godzilla.
in a series full of embarrassing American revisions, King of the Monsters is actually not that bad.
Yeah.
Do you know about Gigantus?
No.
Really quickly, because this is not Honda related at all. And you might just cut this out entirely, but so the sequel, Godzilla Raids Again, comes out the year after the original Godzilla in 55, and it doesn't get released in the States until 1959. And when it finally does, it's retitled Gigantus the Fire Monster for reasons that are not quite clear. For a long time, the rumors were that they couldn't. It was I think released by Warner Brothers, and it was Warner Brothers didn't pay for the rights to use the name Godzilla, which seems suspect to me. And then it was they didn't. Godzilla wasn't a franchise, so Gigantus Godzilla doesn't really make a difference. It's a monster. People are going to show up. But it's this really bizarre cut of the movie where they reference the original Godzilla, and there are clips from the original Godzilla, but he's called Gigantus, and actually the entire time he has Angurus's roar. He doesn't have Godzilla's roar.
What?
It's a very, very strange thing, and they add in stock footage of Unknown Island, and there's lizard dinosaurs, Komodo dragons with
Slurposaurs.
Yeah. It's a very strange movie.
Does Angurus also? Does Angurus have Godzilla's roar, or does Angurus have Angurus's roar too?
They both have Angurus roars.
Okay.
It's a very strange thing that happened. I don't know what took place there, but that's probably the biggest butcher job that any of the movies ever seen, which is saying a lot.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. So compared to that, King of Monsters is
King
a
of Monsters
masterpiece
is actually fairly clever in how they handle it. Not
yeah.
perfect, but it's
Right.
it's an honest attempt, I think.
Is it true that they shot all those scenes with Raymond Burr in a 24-hour period?
I think that's a myth.
Okay.
I think it was something like 3 days.
Gotcha. Yeah, that was just something that I'd always heard, and I didn't know. And he definitely does have a mood about him that fits the mood of the film. Yeah.
Raymond Burr took those movies. I mean, and he shows up again in Godzilla '85, but he took those movies very, very seriously.
Yeah.
Whenever someone would joke about, oh, you did that Godzilla movie for 3 days or however many days he was on set for that, he actually was known to get pretty defensive about it.
Wow.
Or maybe not defensive, but he stuck up for the integrity of those movies, which is cool.
Ah, good on him. Way to go, Steve Martin. Not that Steve Martin.
The original Steve Martin.
much less funny.
Yeah.
Steve Martin.
So do we have anything else? I mean, we could probably talk about the original Godzilla for.
Yeah, I was about to say we probably
longer,
have about several days more Godzilla 54 material, but that was not the only film that Ishiro Honda directed in 1954, surprisingly.
At all.
And I am very excited about this because this is something that I think a lot of people over here in the West haven't seen, maybe don't even know exist.
If Letterboxd is to be believed, I think like literally 2 people have. Letterboxd is not the be all end all, but not many people have seen this movie in the States.
Yeah, so Ishiro Honda did direct other films aside from the science fiction films, as we discussed before, and one of those was a very interesting World War II drama entitled Farewell Rabaul, which again came out in 1954. Also features Honda standard Ikehiko Hirata and some other players as well.
And we should note too, this came out actually before Godzilla.
Yes,
So this is February. Godzilla is October, November.
Yeah, that's important to mention.
Before Godzilla, I think was even a concept because I think they started writing Godzilla in April. I could be wrong, but that movie came by today's standards together very quickly. I don't know if that was the norm back. I'm sure that was probably norm back then. But like you think of big blockbuster movies today, and it's like thinking about a effects movie going in 7 months from like conception to release is crazy.
Yeah, that's unbelievable considering all that they did. But anyway, yeah. So Farewell Rabaul, very interesting film. I guess briefly the premise: it follows a number of Japanese fighter pilots who are on the strategic island of Rabaul, which is, I guess, one of the last strategic points that the Japanese airplanes can take off from, and they're in really hot and heavy aerial warfare with the Americans. It's late in the war, so it follows one Air Force captain, but it's actually a bit of an ensemble piece. Mm-hmm. I was reminded, although tonally these two movies are completely different, I was kind of reminded of Howard Hawks' Only Angels Have Wings.
Me too, absolutely.
In terms of the setting and the ensemble nature of the piece, and also the very brooding, jaded main character to some extent.
And also just in terms of how they cope with death.
Yeah.
And sort of the equation of people and their machinery. But yeah, no, so just backing up a little bit, really happy to finally see a non-sci-fi Honda movie. Because first of all, he did so many, and B, from the impression I got from the book, he was always kind of, I think, frustrated to a degree that he was so associated with sci-fi. Not that he resented those movies necessarily, but it makes sense. He's a filmmaker with this range, and he wants to be known for other things. Yeah. So to finally get to see it was great. And I think even not knowing that this was a Honda movie, I feel like it still very much has his sensibility and his emotional sensibility, where he is thinking about Japan, of course, but he's thinking about war on a global scale and what it does to people. There's this really fascinating scene with the American pilot. That was kind of the thing that stuck out to me, was Captain Oni, as they call him. Oni meaning devil. Mm-hmm. Has this kind of arch nemesis called Yellow Snake, and Yellow Snake gets shot down, and he's this kind of average Joe American.
Yeah, is a refrigerator salesman.
He's a refrigerator salesman, yeah, and the acting's not great, but there's still like this earnestness to him, like this kind of gee whiz, kind of Boy Scout feel that you get from him. It's so interesting seeing a Japanese movie. This is after the occupation, so there's less strict regulations on how they can depict American soldiers and the Japanese military. And just seeing this character as this average Joe guy who's actually really impressed and happy to be in the presence of the Japanese pilot.
Yeah, because Captain Oni is very respected in his own right. He's shot a lot of planes. And,
and just seeing this very just human interaction that he has or tries to have, because Oni, of course, is, or we should, that's not his actual name. The Ryo Akebi character, he's kind of humiliated that this is kind of what they're facing. But seeing Akebi's kind of steely demeanor melt away over time, and how that comes into conflict with his underlings who have been trained by him to not fear death and to whatever it takes to win the battle for our country. Seeing that just kind of melt away from him, I thought I was really impressed by that performance. Getting that from his facial expressions and how he's interacting, especially with Akiko Hirata when he's trying to save his life, and you just see that desperation on his face. And the movie, I felt after a while, like I kind of felt like it kept ending in a way. Yeah. Like you have that climax with Akiko Hirata, and you think, okay, that's the conclusion of his arc. He's going to try to save this guy, and then it keeps going, and then Yellow Snake, or even before that, there's an air raid, and this other wounded soldier pilot runs out, and there's that really haunting shot where
it's incredible. Where his arms are lifted out and he's sort of like looking to the sky and just silhouetted by flames, just this wall of fire. And it's a wide shot. I mean, he is not close to the lens at all. He's way back there.
Yeah. And I think there's definitely, I mean, more so than in Honda's other movies, there's a lot of Christian iconography at play here. And I think, the pose he's striking, I think not a stretch to say it's Christ-like. And then you have the cross too that the pilot is carrying throughout. But it just kind of keeps going. You could argue maybe longer than it should, but it's like you just feel like he's just like they're all just trapped in this machine that they've been sort of indoctrinated to want to be a part of, or to at least like devote themselves to, and they just can't escape it, even if they have a change of heart. So I really quite enjoyed this movie.
Yeah, so did I. I was right from the opening. You have again, like we talked about before, Honda knows how to set up a location. And with a lot of the science fiction films, he's always jumping around. You're in this location, you're in Tokyo, you're on Monster Island, you're wherever the case may be. Here, you're on the island of Rabaul the whole time. You're in the barracks, you're in the air, and you're in that tavern. And he just sets up this one place, and there's just so much atmosphere. And as with many Honda films, you have that dance sequence. That opens the movie.
It's a great scene.
Yeah, where there's the native girl whose name is
Kim, right?
Kim. That's right.
And she would actually go on to play dancers in some of his other movies, like King Kong versus Godzilla. She shows up. Oh,
interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that opening where there's very little dialogue. You're just establishing the characters. You have. It rolls off the tongue, so I can't help it. Captain Oni, when he first enters into the bar and sees all of the men drinking, and on the night before the battle, and he's being tough as nails, trying to get them to stop, and so they can rest up for the battle, and the other officers telling him to lighten up. Yeah, just from that great opening, again, establishing a sense of place, character, lots of visual storytelling elements.
And what's so great about that scene is you're getting everything about that character from how other people see him. So he stops at this one group, and they stand to attention. Actually, that scene starts with the dancer stopping her routine and looking over and kind of trembling. Yeah, and he walks out of the shadows.
Yeah, and that's the first time you see him.
Yeah, and he's just very skilled at what you were saying, just showing how other people are reacting to something and establishing it that way. Kind of like again in Godzilla, you see people watching Godzilla, and how they especially the typhoon scene on Odo Island. People are just looking up. You're not seeing it yourself, but you get a full picture from their perspective.
Yeah, it's great, and you have all those different stories playing out throughout the film. You have the other pilot who's played by Hirata. He's in love with that dancer, or maybe he's not. There is some kind of romantic attachment there. She wants him to desert the Air Force and to go off with her, and she's obviously desperately in love with him. There's a young nurse who's working at the hospital, young Japanese nurse. There are at least two very, very young pilots who, again, look up to Captain Oni in some way. One of them dies very tragically early in the film. The other one is basically wants to die, wants to
Mm-hmm.
die in service of the country.
Yeah. I just want to go back. One of the pilot who dies
Mhm.
is played by a very young Akira Kubo, who he shows up in Matango. He shows up kind of in the early to mid '60s, or when most of his kaiju movies. He's in a lot of those. He plays the crazy inventor in Monster Zero, which is my favorite of his characters. But
Beautiful.
it was cool. It was cool seeing him show up this early on, because this is
Hmm.
well before any of the other movies of his that I've seen.
Yeah, he looks like a
Uh,
kid.
yeah,
Like,
I think he was
yeah,
a kid. I think he was like 18 or something.
yeah, that's really something that keeps coming back again and again in the film. Just that idea of sacrifice, but also, defining like what you're sacrificing yourself for. Like, are
Hmm.
you sacrificing yourself for this ideology? Are you sacrificing yourself for other people? Like, why are you going out there and why are you fighting?
Yeah, and it ends on a note that's kind of similar to Godzilla, actually.
Yeah.
Where you have, the American pilot, Japanese pilot, and they've once again taken to the skies, and they're back to being, defined by their planes. They're battling out in the sky, and whatever admiration they have for each other kind of doesn't matter anymore, because they've been fashioned into these, machines that have to go after each other, and that ends, of course, ends tragically for both of them. But that kind of gets back to the idea in Godzilla of Serizawa's fear, H bombs versus H bombs, A bomb versus A bombs, this perpetual cycle of people destroying one another. And then there's that, similar image of the women on the ship singing farewell Rabaul, basically what they're saying. And that's very similar to the prayer for peace in Godzilla, where it's kind of this last. I think Rabaul and Godzilla, they're dark movies, but I think they both understand the value of hope, or at least they don't stamp it out entirely.
Yeah.
There's that vision of unity that you get from that scene at the end, and the scene at the end of Godzilla. The shot at the end too of the ocean kind of spanning out between the two movies.
Yeah, and in Farewell Rabaul as well, there's that moment after Captain Oni shoots down the yellow snake, and there's this wonderful little bit of business where he leans out and he salutes the plane as it goes down, which is like him finally acknowledging his respect for his opponent, and the fact that he's doing it, that he's fighting for that ship of women as well, not just for some like formless, shapeless, not for the machine, but for people that he cares about, and which is cool too, because as we say, it is a drama, but there's tons of action and lots of Eiji Subiara effect sequences, which is
who I don't think we've mentioned before.
No,
which seems ridiculous, because Godzilla is pretty much half his movie. I mean, the way the Japanese film industry was structured back then, movies like this, or at least movies like Godzilla, and basically had two directors: the dramatic director and the effects director. Honda, of course, had input into what Tsuburaya was doing, but really Godzilla being brought to life is largely Tsuburaya's work. There are some really impressive dogfight scenes.
Yeah, especially the final one, because it's interspersed with a lot of newsreel footage taken from the Americans. Mm-hmm. So that's interspersed with Tsuburaya's model work.
Yeah, and I think it was Eagle of the Pacific, right? That Tsuburaya, his models were so lifelike that the American intelligence actually thought that he was a spy. It might have been War at Sea, which is not a Honda movie. War at Sea from Hawaii to Malay. One of those two movies. He did a World War II movie that depicted the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and it was, like I said, it was so realistic that the Americans thought that he had actually been filming the bombings as it happened.
Just to show how respected he was as well, I think. Wasn't there a biography of him, an authorized biography?
There was,
that came out before Honda's?
Yeah, it's called Master of Monsters by August Ragone. It's very, very good. There's more like concept art and photographs throughout the book than the Honda one. So it's cool. Like there's all these really neat behind the scenes glimpses.
So regarding the dogfight sequences, so we start out with mainly newsreel footage, and then it seems like there's more and more miniature work interspersed as the film goes on.
Yeah,
but still, you're back pretty far. You don't really get, in too much of the action, and then as the film goes on, and especially in that final dogfight, you're getting closer and closer shots of the planes. You're more involved with the dogfight. Feels more like a sequence than something kind of observing.
Right.
Far away.
Tsuburaya actually would a year later for Godzilla Raids Again. I don't know. Have you seen Godzilla Raids Again?
I have. It's been years.
Okay, but so there's a scene at the end. It's basically a dogfight with Godzilla.
Yeah. Are they on They're on like a mountain slope, right? A snowy.
They're on like an iceberg. A snowy mountain area. The effects in Rabaul are pretty impressive, but it is. I think he does come a long way just in that 1 year from Rabaul to Raids Again. I mean, obviously that's what I was kind of thinking of watching this movie, watching its effect scenes. I mean, I think Tsuburaya kind of ties well into the next movie. If you want to,
Yes.
unless you have something else to say about Rabaul.
No, I think that about covers it. Yeah, it's a rarity for sure, but I hope it's one that people, I don't know, get to see more of.
If you are able to track it down,
yeah, good luck.
I'm not even entirely sure how we tracked it down. We had kind of a third party do that.
Yeah.
If you can manage to find it, certainly check it out.
Yeah. So bringing us to our next film, which is The Mysterians. Yeah, Jackson, do you want to summarize this one?
So I mean, it's an alien invasion movie. Basically, the Mysterians, who are from, I want to say, a planet from right behind the moon that has never been discovered. They come down and they request two things. So their planet's dying because they had this global conflict, nuclear conflict. They want a patch of land on Earth to live, and they want to breed with the Earth women. So first thing, maybe negotiable. Second thing,
so much.
And then they start kidnapping the women, which is going even further than that. So
yeah.
Then there's basically a fight with the aliens. There's this big climactic alien dogfight scene. There's a giant robot called Mogera who shows up. And yeah, it's basically the template for pretty much all of the alien invasion Toho movies up until the mid-'70s, I would say, where you have this alien race that's like kind of there under semi-friendly pretenses, less so here, but still like they're trying to negotiate. And then just kind of all hell breaks loose, and we have to design these crazy super weapons to defeat them.
Yeah, like that really awesome rocket. What is that called again?
It's called the Beta.
Okay.
There's one that kind of looks like a blimp. Oh, there's the Alpha and the Beta. Okay.
Okay.
And the Mysterians have like this giant dome and the aforementioned giant robot.
And those super cool multicolored uniforms.
Yeah, that distinguish their ranks.
Yeah, not too far afield from how the Power Rangers would look in years to come.
Very similar, actually. Yeah, very bright reds and yellows, and that kind of like motorcycle helmet.
Yeah, they do look super cool. It was years before I saw the Mysterians, but I remember seeing them on the poster and going like, wow, those are some pretty cool looking invaders.
And I love how Mogera looks in this movie. He's the first like Toho robot, and he's so clunky and it's like really kind of inefficient.
Yeah.
He can shoot beams out of his eyes, so that's helpful. But then he's got like this really goofy like drill nose.
Yeah.
And like these like bunny ear antenna. It's really wonderful.
Yeah, he's a cute little fella for sure.
Yeah. I love how the second one dies because he burrows right under a giant piece of equipment and it just collapses on him.
Come on.
So do you want to kind of get into the nitty gritty? Because you hadn't seen this before, right?
I had not seen it before, and my reaction was actually kind of muted overall. I thought the effect sequences were very cool. It reminded me to some extent, I guess, story-wise, some parallels that could be made to the George Powell War of the Worlds in terms of the build-up. And there is definitely a human element present, but not as strong as in some of my favorite of the SFX movies that Honda did. Really, the thing that impressed me the most about the film, aside from those effect sequences and the look of the thing, which is really great, was Akira Ifukube's score.
Oh God!
And this is something about all of Honda's films, because watching through a lot of these as a kid, of course, I remembered the theme to Godzilla, but I never really noticed the scores. And holy crap, I'm thinking of the finale of Rodan especially, but the march and the battle music in the Mysterians is just so adrenaline pumping.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And it's actually kind of a diverse score too, because you have those great marches, and you have the music where they're fighting Mogera, and it's like this really like rousing military kind of march, I guess. You also have like this really weird, like the way it opens in space. It's kind of like nervy. It's kind of reminiscent of like Bernard Herrmann's score for Day the Earth Stood Still.
Yeah.
Not in terms of the instruments that are being used, but in terms of like it kind of like slithers. Like I listened to it again last night, and like the time signature, like I couldn't tell you what it is. It doesn't really even seem to have one. Like he's just kind of playing notes wherever he sort of feels like it. I mean, maybe there is. I'm sure there is one. But to my untrained ear, it sounds almost random. But that's what makes it. But then you also have the very rhythmic beats of the military theme. It's one of my favorite of his scores, actually. But yeah, overall, like this is not one of my favorite Honda Tsuburaya movies. It's one, like you, I appreciate the effects. I appreciate the extravagance of it. The first widescreen Toho effects movie and in full color too. But it kind of devolves a little bit too much into, the effects wizardry. And you're right, the humans there's enough to get you through, especially, again, Akihiko Hirata is playing a conflicted scientist.
Yeah.
Which is kind of his thing, I guess, in these movies. And his character's interesting because he kind of goes over to the Mysterian side, but not quite entirely, and he's not really sure where he fits in. But I couldn't really tell you anything about the other characters. The Mysterian leader is interesting, even though you don't see what he looks like. Or like in terms of a character, I get more of a character from the Exilian leader from Monster Zero. Yeah, but I mean, the main reason why I wanted to talk about Mysterians was A, the effects, and B, I think this is the movie that best embodies Honda's political concerns, or at least his worldview, because it's a very utopic movie. I think it's the entire world against these exterior forces that mean to wipe us out. You have that. I forget if it's the UN or there's a scene where it is the UN. Okay, so all the nations are meeting, and everyone's opinions are given equal weight. I mean, of course, the Japanese characters are central to the story, but you have the Germans in there. I think you have the Russians and the Americans, and it's everyone collaborating towards the betterment of, towards human survival. And this, I think, it kind of sums up that worldview in its purest form out of all his movies.
Yeah, that's interesting. I remember the thing that stuck out the most to me watching it was that opening. Again, starting with a very strong sense of place. There's that festival in the mountains, and I guess the people there were introduced to our main characters who are attending the festival. Then strange lights in the sky and people going to investigate, and there's that forest fire. It's a really good opening. I think it's near Mount Fuji.
I think it's right at the base of Mount Fuji. Yeah,
great atmosphere.
Yeah, and the way, once again, like in Godzilla, if you're encountering the threat through nature. The Mysterians show up, but you don't see them. You see the forest fire that they're creating. No one knows what's going on. Nature is kind of taking revenge on its own. And what struck me this time around was actually how elemental, even though they're from outer space, how the Mysterians use the Earth against the humans. So you have the fire, you have. I mean, they're subterranean, so they come out under the ground. They cause those earthquakes, which are in and of themselves really impressive effects.
Oh yeah,
seeing the ground just split open like that. There's that one shot of like the tank falling in to like this sinkhole and a guy jumping out, and it must be a miniature that they're launching off this tank, but it's a tank that's being like submerged like in the ground.
Yeah.
But it looks totally convincing. I mean, maybe they did because they actually had the cooperation of the Japanese military for this movie. Yeah. So just how elemental the Mysterians are, and it's the water spurts too coming out of the lake. Yeah, and even their giant robot is basically like a large bull.
Yeah. So it was an interesting one. I'm glad I finally got to see it because I had for years, been really curious about it. And it was a cool experience, but as we both said, I think not one of at least my favorites.
No, again, it's good for getting a sense of the worldview, and also because it's so influential for the other effects movies, this ilk, I think.
Yeah, and technically it works like gangbusters.
Oh yeah, and like George Lucas clearly saw this movie at some point, or Battle in Outer Space, or both. Battle in Outer Space, for those who don't know, is kind of an unofficial sequel to this.
So from a big outer space effects movie, let's get into some more horrific psychedelic territory with Matango. So this one, interestingly enough, has its roots in the West. It's loosely based off of a short story by the cosmic horror and maritime writer William Hope Hodgson, who some of his stories are actually being reprinted these days in these nice multi-volume collections. Highly recommend them. He wrote a series of horror stories set in the Sargasso, basically about ships getting caught in these masses of seaweed and never being able to escape. And there are monsters under the sea that come up and devour the people who are stuck there and forced to live for years. And, in these...
I've never heard of these, but I really want to read them now.
Highly recommend them. And he wrote some great fantasy stuff as well. And again, a lot of it bridging cosmic horror, maritime adventure. Unfortunately, I believe he died. He was a soldier in World War I and was killed in the war. But anyway, great stuff. This story is loosely based off of, the story for Matango is loosely based off of one of his, I believe. I don't know how far that goes. I haven't read the specific story that they're pulling from, but basically it follows a group of people who are on a pleasure yacht, I think. And they find themselves washed ashore on this mysterious island. There's infighting between them. There aren't really many resources on the island. They find a strange, mysterious shipwreck there, and eventually, mushroom people. And it's pretty friggin' great, actually.
Yeah.
Jackson, what are your thoughts on Matango?
Yeah, this is a super creepy movie in my highly analytical take. But no, so yeah, Matango is or Matango. I never know the pronunciation. But
Matango sounds correct, but
okay,
I'm from New Jersey, so
I've always said Matango, so I'm going to say Matango.
Mhm.
But yeah, this has to be his most of the ones that I've seen, his most pessimistic movie, and the one that I think has the least faith in society. But before we get into that, the atmosphere is it's not only a creepy movie, but it's so unique in his filmography. It's really claustrophobic, and you get this sense of dread in this ship. So they take refuge in this shipwreck that's washed up on shore. And you spend a lot of time in there, and you really kind of start to feel the walls closing in on you, and the fungus literally like reaching out and choking them. I do want to call out cinematographer Hajime Koizumi, who I don't know necessarily what else he shot, but the way he shoots the forest, it's really it's lush and colorful, but it's also clearly like this horrific place without even being too overtly horrific. It feels like honestly like kind of anonymous. There's like all these like rows of trees and plants that just kind of recede into the distance forever. You only really get like the horrific like surreality of it like at the end of the movie when the Matango kind of burst onto the scene and you get that like nightmare scene where Akira Kubo like goes to save the love interest, basically. Yeah, it's really scary.
Yeah, and it's cool too because as you mentioned that forest location, there is a lot of location shooting in the film.
Oh yeah,
they're on the beach, and I think there's some stuff in a real forest. But then as they go deeper and deeper, there are these really great sets standing in for the forest where there's more. It's more of a stylized environment.
Yeah. Yeah, and it feels really dissonant. Like they've been transported to this completely alternate dimension.
Yeah, it adds to the fear factor. You're going deeper into the mystery and deeper into the horror, and you're sort of leaving the real world behind you as you do that. But it's cool because it starts again with that human element. The interpersonal bickering between the people on the yacht, the sailors, the people who own the yacht, their friends, trying to decide who's going to be in charge, what they're going to do. Do they try to find food? Do they stay put? What is their plan going to be? Even that itself is pretty compelling and pretty intense as they're trapped in that boat. This is a widescreen film, right? Isn't it?
Yeah.
It's scope. And, claustrophobia with the widescreen frame is a very specific kind of claustrophobia, where it's a large canvas, but that just means the walls can close in on you that much more. Yeah, really effective zooms and, different camera moves to sort of box you into that space. There are some psychedelic fungi involved, so we get a couple of great trippy sequences in there as well. I think some of the most far out stylization that I've ever seen in a Honda movie. Towards the end. Holy crap! And body horror as well.
Yeah,
characters turning into these mushroom creatures.
Yeah, which in and of itself is kind of a subgenre of his sci-fi movies because you have the H-Man, you have human vapor, even a little bit in Terror of Mechagodzilla, which we'll get to, of people just turning into these things that just are not human and they don't have any control over it. But what's scary about Matango is that there's this illusion of control. They don't have to eat the fungi, but something just keeps pulling them back into it. And that's, I think, what makes this one scarier than the other movies is that the characters have that choice and they just can't help but give into that temptation. And there's really no hero. I mean, there is ostensibly Akira Kubo is the hero of the movie. But you have him and Miki Ishiro. Is she his girlfriend, or are they? Is it just kind of implied that there's a dynamic there?
Yeah.
They're kind of like the pure ones, but even they, they can't escape this pull. And by the end of the movie, no one's saved. Like everyone conforms to this lore of the Matango, and it's this really sad ending where he says something like, the only way to live is to become one of them. There really is no other choice. And they're still alive, but not human. And again, Godzilla kind of gives you that gleam of hope at the end. But Matango, I think, kind of stamps it out entirely.
Yeah, and I guess this would be a good time to bring up some of Honda's other collaborators, specifically his two screenwriters who he worked with numerous times. One of which was Shinichi Sekizawa, who I guess generally tended towards more lighthearted fare. I guess,
I
of
think
the
that's
two
fair to say.
screenwriters that
He was more in the realm of, I'd say, like fairy tales.
Yeah.
Which is not to demean fairy tales, but yeah, more like fantastical,
with more of an optimistic edge. And the other screenwriter who Honda worked with, who was in his own life a political radical, someone who definitely had some very unique views, was Takeshi Kimura, who tended to write the very pessimistic Honda films, the films that tended towards darker subject matter and more out there concepts. It was Kimura who wrote Matango. Yeah. Then again, it's also kind of surprising because he wrote the Mysterians, which flip things around. So not a hard and fast rule, but I guess in general, Takeshi Kimura tended to write darker material, and Sekizawa tended to write the more fantastical scripts. Two gentlemen who I was not aware of really until reading the biography.
Yeah, me neither.
Once it was called attention that Kimura wrote these screenplays, Sekizawa wrote these screenplays, it was like, there are these other creative influences running through the films in addition to Honda's, which was really cool to see.
And speaking of other collaborators, this is one of the rare Honda movies that's not scored by Ifukube. You have Sadao Beiku, and I'm sorry, Japanese is not my forte, so if I'm mispronouncing these names, I apologize. But and it's this really like jazzy score. I think is the best way to describe it. It doesn't really have like a motif like all of Fukube's themes do. There's nothing that's like immediately like hummable necessarily. Yeah, it's really unsettling. It bridges the gap between the fantastical world of the Matango and this island, and also just modern day Japan, which is shot in a really stark, like kind of dank way.
Yeah. Especially that ending where it's again very, very dark, but with those little pops of color.
Yeah, again, not like anything I've seen in any other Honda movie. It almost feels like an opening of a noir.
Oh yeah, like that wouldn't be out of place in a Seijun Suzuki movie.
Oh God, yeah.
So that brings us to the next film, which we're going to talk about, which is 1975's Terror of Mechagodzilla. So Jackson, you want to take this one? Give us a little bit of a primer on this film.
Right, so this is the final Godzilla film in what's known as the Showa era. So the films that span from 1954 to 1975. And it's a sequel to Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla, where the black hole aliens are rebuilding Mechagodzilla, and they seek the aid of a scientist, again played by Akihiko Hirata, to help them rebuild. Now this time, they have on their side a dinosaur monster called Titanosaurus, who's under the mind control of Dr. Mifune because he's invented this sort of animal control device that got him kind of kicked out of whatever institute he was a part of. While this is happening, Mifune's daughter, Katsura, is sort of reluctantly helping her father and the aliens, and we find out what's going on is that the aliens have actually implanted the Mechagodzilla control device inside of her. So she's kind of stuck. She doesn't really have a choice. And, eventually Godzilla shows up and he fights these two monsters. And I don't know if we're spoiling things here.
No, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay, so Katsura has to kill herself to defeat Mechagodzilla because the control's inside of her. And Godzilla kind of walks off like a cowboy into the sunset, thus ending 21 years of loosely connected films, but technically the end of this series. Briefly, it's a really distinct movie. And the 70s were a weird time for Godzilla because TV was taking over in Japan. Budgets were dwindling. These movies were really relegated to kids festivals. They weren't getting like giant mainstream releases. So the Godzilla in the 70s took all these weird different avenues. So you have Godzilla versus Hedra, which is like psychedelic and crazy, and Godzilla flies at one point.
Yeah.
And then Godzilla versus Gigan, which you mentioned earlier. Gigan is like a space buzzard, and he's got like a buzzsaw on his chest. And Megalon and these movies were made pretty cheaply, and just kind of going in crazier directions. And Terror of Mechagodzilla kind of bucks a lot of that. Like it's a pretty cheap. It's not a bad looking movie, but you could tell it was made for not that much money. Like there's not a lot of very elaborate sets or effect sequences necessarily. There are a few, we'll get to that. But it's really actually kind of a somber movie. It is. In a lot of ways a silly movie, but probably not since the original Godzilla has a Godzilla movie been this contemplative in terms of how it's treating its human characters as real dramatic components of the film. So it's an interesting movie. What did you think of it?
Oh, let's see. So I saw a bunch of the Godzilla movies when I was growing up, and I remember as a kid not liking Terror of Mechagodzilla and preferring Godzilla versus Mechagodzilla, because that was the more, I guess, cartoony, bombastic,
Oh yeah.
what I would have expected from a Godzilla movie, sort of like, WWF with more realistic characters. Terror of Mechagodzilla, I didn't like when I was a kid because it was sad and there was, again, like you said, contemplative pace, and it's still the giant monster mashes. There are cackling mad scientists and aliens. I mean, there's a scene where I think most of the dialogue is maniacal laughter.
Yes, there's a few scenes like that.
Crazy, outlandish stuff, but at the same time, there is a human element at the center of it, and it's a tragic one, which is interesting. Again, you have a torn, dark scientist character played by Akihiko Harada. His daughter, who was dead and brought back to life by the aliens, and so he is, very much beholden to them, and she is as well, whether she likes it or not, because they brought her back to life as the cyborg. And what struck me revisiting it as an adult, just recently, was how involved the human characters are in the giant monster part of the film. I mean, usually with these movies, because especially the later ones, where they become less and less connected to any semblance of cinematic reality, it's almost as if the monster battles are taking place on another plane of existence.
Very much so.
Anything happening with the humans, because you're clearly on a set. The camera is positioned up at eye level with the monsters. Long gone are the days of the first Godzilla movie where everything is a low angle shot where you're looking human's eye view at these things. Now it's the monsters are being shot in the same manner as the actors, the human-sized actors. Mm-hmm. But with this movie, you have human characters sort of taking over, being directly attached to the monsters. You have the scientist who is controlling Titanosaurus and has a stake in what happens to Titanosaurus. His daughter, who, the controls for Mechagodzilla are inside her, and so she is directly linked to Mechagodzilla. And really, Godzilla himself kind of takes a back seat in the film for much of it. He shows up in several sequences and has an absolutely phenomenal introduction, which is, it's so good.
So Titanosaurus is destroying the city.
Right.
The breath comes in, and Titanosaurus, this is like an hour into the movie, and Godzilla has been mentioned like once or twice. It's actually kind of like the Gareth Edwards movie where he's sort of hinted at, and then he only shows up for real at the very end. But Titanosaurus is laying waste to the city, and just suddenly like the breath comes in and it knocks him over, and you just see him belly flop over, and then there's like this quiet shot of the city. There's no music, there's no sound effects, and just panning over, and you see something like kind of poking out of a building. And then there's this hard zoom in, and Godzilla's silhouetted by like this explosion, and then his face
like
lights up.
Strobing on him.
Yeah, and he roars. It's great. It's the proper entrance for Godzilla.
Yeah, I mean, as you described, that snap zoom in to the silhouette of Godzilla, and then the light coming up on his face is. Yeah. Oh man, it's so good. Yeah, but aside from that, I mean, you've got cartoonish aliens in the film as well. Who are cackling and plotting and maniacal.
Yeah. And you can tell the series again has declined in terms of budgets because they're not meeting in elaborate, space sets or anything. They're meeting in like office buildings.
Yeah, it opens in the office building. I think they have one little control center.
They do,
where they hang out, and it's all silver, and that's kind of cool. But again, it's smaller.
No, it is. Yeah. It knows that it can't be as outlandish as like the '60s movies. Better than something like Gigan, in which you're absolutely right. The monsters and the humans feel very separate. This movie, I think, acknowledges its kind of limited resources and it ingrains that into the tone because it's a very subdued movie in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Also, very in a lot of ways, it's not because there's all that cackling, but really, but it still is very somber and kind of sparse in terms of how it's designed.
Yeah.
But in a way that works. It doesn't feel like lazy.
Yeah, because you have, in addition to the mad scientist and his daughter working with and occasionally against the aliens, You have an Interpol agent and another scientist. I think he's a biologist. They are teaming up to investigate this submarine that is destroyed by Titanosaurus. Although they don't really know it's Titanosaurus yet. That leads them to the doctor and to his daughter. The scientist who's doing the investigation ends up developing romantic feelings towards the doctor's daughter, who is telling them, "Oh no, my father's dead. He burned all of his notes, so you can't. I can't help you." Basically that kind of thing. And but they persist, and they end up discovering what's going on with the aliens, with Titanosaurus and Mechagodzilla. And there is other stuff going on in terms of, we do see politicians who are trying to mobilize the military. They try to develop
a little bit of that.
Certainly less than in previous movies.
As much as they can do, given the budgetary restraints. Yeah.
Right. Long gone are the days when they actually had the cooperation of the Japanese military to bring in all these real weapons. And they're also developing a supersonic weapon because they realize that sonar has a negative effect on Titanosaurus, and so they develop a weapon to
and again designed very, very simplistically. It's not like a maser cannon.
Right. They just have essentially a satellite dish and a helicopter.
Basically,
which again is kind of cool because you have the humans sort of existing in the same realm as the monsters again, where they are in the helicopter flying around trying to zap Titanosaurus so that Godzilla can focus on fighting Mechagodzilla.
And I mean the key to that connection between the kaiju and the humans is Katsura. And we should mention this was certainly the first, I think the only time a Godzilla movie was ever written by a woman. So there's actually a little bit of a story behind this. Terror of Mechagodzilla was a winning script in a contest. This student, and let me get her name up. Her name is, and she's actually still writing, Yukiko Takayama. She was this student who submitted a screenplay draft for a sequel to Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla, and she ultimately won. And she's the only credited writer on the film. I mean, I'm sure Honda did a pass, as most directors do, but it's unique in that regard. And I don't think it's any coincidence that Katsura is one of probably the most well-defined female characters in the entire series. And this is really her story, and it's about how she really has no autonomy. Nothing she does is her choice. She's been reworked into being this machine and basically an extension of a monster. And she's kind of like her father's sacrificial lamb in a way to the aliens, and him exacting his revenge on the scientific community. We still get a sense of what her desires are and how she wants to be seen and how she wants to interact with the scientist character, how she wants to be this agent of good. So she doesn't end up feeling just like a prop. We get that sense of conflict. Also, the sense of the performance that she has to put on, because when the scientists show up at the house, she has to put on this very steely facade and insist that her father is dead. And then she closes the door, and we see this kind of other side of her. So it's a really interesting character. You don't get a lot of very developed female characters in this franchise. Unfortunately, there have been a few since then, but
and it's true. She is, definitely the centerpiece of the film. The film really opens with her because we have that submarine under the water, and we see essentially these characters who are going to become victims of Titanosaurus. But we see her sitting on the rocks, watching all this happen, and it's never really explained, who this figure is that you're seeing, and then later, when she's introduced as a character, you begin to understand more of what's going on with her. Very much so the most interesting character in the film. Lots of conflict. And
there's a really interesting moment with her, too, that we haven't really talked about Honda's affection for the monsters so much. We talked a little bit about it with Godzilla. Titanosaurus is a really tragic figure, too. And Honda and Takayama, the writer, they don't let us forget that he is by nature this very gentle animal.
Right.
And there's a really interesting moment where Katsura is kind of pleading with her father and asking what is Titanosaurus's place in the monster hierarchy going to be? Is he going to be a heroic monster, or is he going to be a villain like King Ghidorah or Rodan? And then we see the clips of these destructive monsters. It's this interesting moment of compassion for the monster and how he's going to be viewed. And of course, he doesn't get that chance at redemption, which is part of what makes this movie so tragic.
And it is sad because on the one hand, Titanosaurus is under alien control, destroying the city, but when he gets zapped by the supersonic weapon, you do feel bad. It's just something that this element of nature that's just kind of caught in the middle.
Also, his roar is really cool.
Oh yeah, love it.
It's like a trumpet blowing underwater. I don't know how to describe.
Yeah, there's definitely a gargling quality to it.
Yeah. It's kind of funny. It's called Terror of Mechagodzilla. We haven't really talked about Mechagodzilla at all.
Mechagodzilla's in this movie?
Which kind of
Yeah.
Mechagodzilla I think is the least impressive thing about the movie.
Although I guess he is in it more than Godzilla.
Yeah, I guess so. And of course he factors into the story even when he's not on screen. But he kind of feels like an afterthought too. I mean, Titanosaurus feels like more of a prominent character in this Mechagodzilla. However, that's not to say he doesn't get any great moments, because Teruyushi Nakano, who is the effects director, he kind of, it wasn't an exact replacement thing necessarily, but he was kind of the other well-known effects director aside from Tsuburaya in the original Godzilla series, and he's kind of known as a pyromaniac. And he really gets, I mean, the last Mechagodzilla movie demonstrated that, but he really gets to let loose in this one, because he basically we just see him destroy an entire city block in just one shot with just all the explosives.
Oh man, is that the one where it starts as close up on Mechagodzilla and then it zooms out and then
something like that? Yeah,
you basically see the entire set floor just
basically, yeah, and Mechagodzilla is just blowing up everything in sight.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
It's crazy. Speaking of, there are a lot of zooms in this movie.
Yeah.
And it's not that Honda never used zooms, but I feel like there were a lot of shots where we would start really wide, and we would, as the scene was taking place, just really quickly, not quite a snap zoom, but just kind of push in. Like the scene where the scientists are talking to those people on the dock and they're telling him where Mifune lives. Really unusual shots for him, I think. And it's worth noting that he hadn't directed a movie since in 5 years, I think.
Okay, yeah, because he had been in television, right?
Yeah.
Working on various pilots and
yeah. And by this time, his main kind of repertoire, Tsuburaya had passed away, and he still had Akira Fukube. And should we mention, this is the first time you hear the Godzilla theme since the original movie, the main one. But Haru Nakajima was retired, and the screenwriters didn't work in this movie at all. So it's interesting seeing him work with a totally new crew after having not worked for so long in the film industry.
For sure, yeah, it's definitely an elegy to that that Honda, as well as to the Godzilla films as a whole.
Yeah, and I don't think they planned it on being the last one, but it certainly feels like a finale. Again, with Godzilla walking into the sunset like a cowboy.
Yeah, it's marvelous. Which I guess that brings us to unless you had any other thoughts on Terror of Mechagodzilla.
Not really. It's an interesting movie. It's not a perfect movie. Certainly, it's a little too broad in how it characterizes Mifune, and it's a little bit dry for parts of it. But yeah, it's got the most on its mind of any of the late era Godzilla movies.
Kind of veering back and forth between Saturday morning cartoon and tragedy, and then back again. Yeah, I think on the whole it's a win. I definitely loved revisiting it. I got a ton more out of it as an adult than I did when I was a kid, sort of just expecting a bunch of fighting and cartoony action. So, but I guess that brings us to Honda's career beyond Godzilla, beyond directing feature films on his own. This was something that really surprised me reading the biography, because I knew about this part of Honda's career. I knew he was Akira Kurosawa's assistant director on a number of his films, and he was instrumental with Kurosawa's later films. But as far as that went, the extent of his involvement with those movies kind of blew my mind. And it was such an emotional and moving resolution to that biography, to Honda's career and life in film. And also to Kurosawa's, honestly. The sense of closure at the end of the book was really deeply moving. After, as we talked about before, Honda being pigeonholed as this the guy who made the giant monster movies and these big special effects films, wanting to do so much more. He showed a gift for comedy in some of his films and drama, and having all these ideas and other projects that he wanted to work on, and not really being able to do that as a director. Still feeling very loyal to Toho. Obviously he was a man who had a great sense of duty and gratitude and just loved making movies, whatever those films happened to be, but not really getting to do the kind of films, maybe that he would have done if he had been given the choice.
Sure.
Finding some redemption in working with a filmmaker, his best friend, going back to early days of Toho, being an assistant director, and then Kurosawa himself having fallen on hard times, having experienced box office bombs, not really being respected by the Japanese film industry, having attempted suicide at one point in his life, and really being in a dark, dark place, and then the two of them finding each other again.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, everything you said. You mentioned them finding each other again. I mean, they hadn't really spoken, I think, in like 25 years when they met up. I mean, I'm sure
Yeah.
I'm sure they corresponded here and there, but throughout the 50s and 60s, it seems like they really were on two totally different paths. And they, of course, respected each other's work. And we get anecdotes of how Kurosawa, his actors would come to him and they would say, "I'm thinking about being in this Honda movie," and Kurosawa would say, "Well, if it's Honda, I'm sure it'll be good."
Yeah.
So which was really touching,
Mm-hmm.
but they certainly hadn't worked together, but their friendship seems like it was just kind of on hold for a while. So just the ease with which they settled back in, and the fact that Honda, Super Rai was such this massive personality and had a very short fuse, and Honda was kind of the only one who could talk to him when he was having a tantrum on set or if he was storming off. And the fact this was apparent from the very beginning, just how they had such opposite personalities, yet they worked together so well, and they never fought, or fought very rarely. Honda was this very agreeable, it seems like, very agreeable personality, opinionated maybe, but kept to himself a lot. Kurosawa was very much the opposite of that. Like you, I was kind of aware of their collaboration. I knew that Honda worked on Dreams. I had no idea about the extent to which they worked together throughout Honda's final 2 decades or so.
Yeah, it was a big deal because Akira Kurosawa is one of my favorite filmmakers.
Mm-hmm.
In particular, Seven Samurai, Stray Dog, but his later films really hold a special place in my heart. Kagemusha and Ran. Ran being probably my favorite Kurosawa movie. And finding out that Honda was really instrumentally involved in mounting those films, especially the battle scenes, because the man was a soldier, so he knew how to drill those extras and set up those scenes. He really was, in essence, another director on that film.
Very much, yeah. I mean, from what I gather from the book, it seems like he was pretty much everything but name only a co-director on a lot of those movies. And he didn't necessarily write them. And those are still, I think, I don't think it's wrong that Kurosawa gets sole directing credit on those movies. But certainly, I mean, whole sequences of Dreams were largely directed by Honda. The Mount Fuji scene, very effects driven, so it kind of harkens back to his monster movies. You watch there's a great making of documentary for Dreams, and you see just how involved he was. I love too. There's a little anecdote about how Kurosawa would be kind of rounding up his crew and getting them to work faster, and he'd be pointing over to Honda moving some like piece of equipment across the set, and he'd be like, "Honda is breaking his back and doing all the work. Why aren't you guys like him? He's not stopping to rest. Why are you guys?" And it just seems like he was just kind of tireless.
Yeah, and going back to Dreams, watching that film, having read Kurosawa's autobiography, there are anecdotes. Some of the sequences in Dreams, obviously, the dreamer in the film, the character who goes through all these different dreams, is supposed to be a stand-in for Kurosawa. Sure. There are things that relate to Kurosawa's life and obviously actual dreams that he did have. But there's that one sequence in the film. There's that one sequence where the main character is dressed in a soldier's uniform and is coming back from war. He's going through the tunnel. In this, the short story as a part of the film, he encounters his fallen comrades, the dead Japanese soldiers who did not make it back from war. And you stop and you think about it and you go, wait a minute. Kurosawa wasn't in the army.
Yeah.
Like, this isn't him. It's Honda. It has to be, and if you see, on set, photographs, I mean, he is very much involved in directing that scene, choreographing all the movements of the soldiers as they're walking through. And it's crazy because that is, I mean, if anything points towards what the collaboration of Kurosawa and Honda was like on those films, that moment has to be it, where there is a story, a vignette in Dreams that is, it's Honda's as much as, the rest of the film is Kurosawa's.
Yeah, and Honda clearly, it's described how he had that survivor's guilt, and we talked about the shell not going. I mean, he recognized that he was very, very lucky. Yeah, and on one hand, it's too bad that Honda never, because he lived a long time after Terror of Mechagodzilla. He lived almost 20 years after that, and it's too bad he never directed another movie, especially not another non-effects movie. But it's also, the sense I get is that he was very content making these films with his friend.
There's something very sweet about that. Yeah, again, it seemed like really fit his personality, being able to team up with his own friend Kurosawa, and obviously the rapport they had. I mean, it seemed like they were almost giddy. The fun that they had planning these films and executing their vision.
I like how they would on the weekends they would go to Honda's house and like watch sumo wrestling.
Yeah, what a really triumphal way for him to see out his career and his life in film. Kurosawa gave a speech at Honda's funeral, didn't he?
Yeah, he did.
I don't know if you have the direct quote there.
I mean, I have the book here. I don't know if it'll take me a while to find the quote, but I do know while I'm looking for that, it mentions that at Honda's funeral, that was the last time and the first time in a long time that Kurosawa and Toshiro Mifune saw each other.
Yeah, wow. That's unbelievable. That's right, because, Mifune was in a lot of Honda's films, some of the early dramas.
Yeah, he was in, he has a role in Eagle of the Pacific. I think he has a supporting role. I don't think he ever played a lead in a Honda movie, although I could be wrong.
Right, yeah, I think he played major supporting roles. He played a sailor, not the Blue Pearl, but another, maybe he wasn't.
I want to say, was it? Yeah, okay, it was The Man Who Came to Port.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
that's that. I thought that was the title, but I didn't want to get it wrong. Interesting facts. Assistant director in that movie was Jun Fukuda, who would direct pretty much all the non-Honda 60s and 70s movies.
Yeah, including Godzilla versus Megalon, which is the greatest of all films.
I love Godzilla versus Megalon.
it's a blast.
What a wonderful film. We should talk about that at some point. But so I have the quote. It's actually a headstone inscription. Honda was a truly virtuous, sincere, and a gentle soul. He worked for the world of film with might and main, lived a full life, and very much like his nature, quietly exited his world. That apparently is on Honda's gravestone, and that's what Kurosawa said about him.
Wow, it's extraordinary. Did Honda work on every one of Kurosawa's films up to the end, or did he pass away after?
I think he did. I think from Kagemusha to the end, to Matadayo.
It's incredible. Well, I guess that about wraps things up for the discussion. There is one other quote I would like you to read from the book, though. Okay. I think it's on the last page. Okay. I believe it's on the last page, or maybe the second to last page. But it's a quote directly from Honda.
Is it this very last quote?
I believe so.
Begins my nightmares.
Yeah, let's hear that one, and that'll take us out for the episode.
Okay. My nightmares are almost always about war. Wandering the streets, searching for someone that's lost forever. But it's possible for me to will myself to have pleasant dreams. For me, the most wonderful fragrance in the world is new film. You open the canister for the first time and breathe deeply. That night, the same wonderful fragrance fills your dreams. It's grand.
Yeah, I think that about says it all. Well, Jackson, this was a wonderful time. Thanks so much.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, we got to do this again sometime. This was great. Yeah, until next time, I'll catch you later.
Thanks for having me on.
Thanks a lot. And to you ladies and gentlemen out there, thanks for listening.